Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Last week, we kicked off our stewardship season on Sabbath by looking at God's command to rest. And today we hear another part of the Sabbath commandment, how God calls us to remember. As you probably know, observe the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments, number 4, if you're curious. And the 10 commandments actually show up in 2 places in the Bible, once in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy. The 2 lists are almost identical, but there are a few differences. And one difference has to do with the Sabbath. The Sabbath commandment from Exodus that we heard last week points back to the story of creation. God rested on the 7th day, therefore we also rest. Our rest is a participation in God's holy rest. It is acknowledging that God is the one in charge, not us, and that our frenetic activity does not, in fact, keep the world spinning. In Deuteronomy, as we heard this morning, the commandment sounds a little bit different. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The text reads, "For remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember what you've been through, how God has been faithful to you your whole life long. Remember when you were slaves and you could not rest. Remember how God delivered you from Pharaoh's treachery and brought you to a land where you were free. Therefore, you will worship God by resting and remembering. Remember. Friends, do we remember who we are and how God has been faithful to us? See, if we follow the story of Israel in the wilderness, we'll see that the Sabbath commandment in Exodus comes at the very beginning of Israel's journey. Moses has just led them out of Egypt. They've miraculously crossed through the Red Sea. God has fed them with manna. Of course they remember what God has done for them. But by the time we get Deuteronomy, they've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. A whole generation has come and gone. The memories have started to fade into old stories, and the people have started to forget. Therefore, God says, observe the Sabbath day and remember. Remember. How do we remember those major crossroads and milestones on our journeys of faith and life? As individuals and as a church community, where in our lives can we look back and say, surely God was there? And were it not for God's presence, God's faithfulness, I would never have made it through. What stories do we have as Christians, as a church, as a community that we have to pass on to future generations? What do we need to tell to God's people in Taos who will come after us? What are our stories like the Hebrews' deliverance from Egypt that we must keep telling because They teach us who we are and who God is and how God calls us to live in this strange, beautiful world. Jesus and his disciples sat down in an upper room to share a meal and remember. Luke makes sure to tell us that Jesus' Last Supper took place at a Passover Seder, a ritual meal that he longed to share with his disciples. At Passover, as many of you know, Jews to this day remember and tell the story of how God delivered them out of Egypt. Every year, our Jewish brothers and sisters eat symbolic foods: lamb shank for the slaughtered lamb whose blood marked their doors, salt water for their tears in slavery, matzah because they fled so quickly the bread did not have time to rise. So when he lifted up that bread and cup that we now break and bless in communion, Jesus was taking part already in that sacred act of remembering God's faithfulness. And so picking up on that theme, Jesus said, listen, I will tell you a new chapter in an old story. See how the God who was faithful to our ancestors in ages past is still delivering God's people. My hour has come to be betrayed and crucified, Jesus said, but first, eat this bread, for it is my body, which is given for you. And drink this cup, for it is the new covenant sealed in my own blood, poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And now every time you eat bread or drink the cup, remember God's faithfulness. Do this in remembrance of me. So we do. We, the church, call this meal a sacrament, a meal where we share in the mystery of Christ's sacrifice of body and of blood, a table of grace where we remember Christ's faithfulness, not just with our minds, but with our bodies. Communion is scandalous, it's strange, and it's deeply visceral. Perhaps that's the whole point. Because the thing about memory is, it's not just something we do with our minds, is it? No. Memory is so much deeper than that. Think with me for a minute. Have you ever walked into a room and just been overcome by a smell? Maybe it's cedar, maybe it's old leather or a certain flower or the perfume your grandmother used to wear. And suddenly you're standing there, but you are transported back decades by that smell to feelings you had no idea you even remembered. You're overcome by a memory that resides not in your thinking mind, but in your body and soul. A memory that is visceral, embodied, incarnate. Communion invokes that kind of visceral memory, doesn't it? It tastes like bread and it smells like, well, in my embodied memory, it smells like Welch's grape juice. Communion is remembering with our whole selves. Eat, drink, and remember Christ's faithfulness. Do this in remembrance of me. I think that Sabbath, too, is that visceral kind of remembering. We stop the constant activity of our bodies and minds and little electronic devices so that we can remember God's faithfulness. Remember it in every single part of ourselves. Maybe that's what all of worship is about. All of our rituals. We come to the same place at the same time over and over, and we do the same things. We stand, we sit, we sing, we confess, we read, we listen, we hug, we splash water, we pass plates, we eat and we drink, and we say those same words over and over again, week after week, and in doing so, we remember. Not just here, but here.
Oh, yeah.
Our very worship enacts that memory of who we are and whose we are and who God is and how God's faithfulness continues to carry us through each day. We remember God's faithfulness in ages past. We bear witness to where God is being faithful among us today. And then we dare to confess our faith, that God will continue to be faithful to God's people for years to come, long after you and I are gone. So it's stewardship season, and we're asking, why do we give? Our precious time, our precious money, our whole selves, why would we give that away in a worshiping community? And I think perhaps it's because we are called to remember. Because we believe that what we do here matters, that somehow in our activity, our ritual over and over, we keep the memory of God's faithfulness alive in this time, in this place. We proclaim that good news of the gospel, that God is faithful still. So friends, keep the Sabbath day. And remember, do this, all of this, Christ says, in remembrance of me. Thanks be to God.